I wasn't looking for anything that day. In truth, I hadn't been looking for anything for a long time. At 78, you learn that life isn't a race for answers or decisive moments. It's more like a river that slows down near the end. It still moves, but without haste, without fanfare. And I was fine that way. At least, that's what I told myself. That Tuesday morning, I woke up, as usual, slowly, my body asking for a few more minutes before accepting the day. The light streamed weakly through the bedroom window, that pale autumn light that doesn't warm, only illuminates. I got up, made coffee, and sat in the same chair as always. The silence of the house no longer bothered me. After Harold died, 6 years earlier, the silence ceased to be emptiness and became simply presence, a neutral company without demands. But that morning, something was different. It wasn't anything visible, nothing I could name if someone asked me. It was more of a feeling, a kind of gentle weight on my chest, as if something was nearing its end and I knew it without knowing exactly what. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. I drank my coffee, looking out the kitchen window. The street was empty, as it always was at that hour. The trees had already lost almost all their leaves. The wish the few that slowly, on at a team as after disease. I saw myself in those pages, not in a sad way, not exactly, just real. I knew my time was running out, not because I was sick, my health was good for my age, but because something inside me had already begun to loosen. It was as if my body and mind had made a silent agreement. We're still here, but not forever. And then I thought about something I hadn't thought about in years. I thought about how I had lived. Not in the big milestones, marriage, children, losses, but in the day-to-day. In the tone of my words, in the way I looked at people, in the way I occupied the world around me. And I realized, with a strange and sudden clarity, that I had spent a good part of my life in a state of silent waiting, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be valued, waiting for someone to recognize how hard I tried to do everything right. But nobody ever acknowledged it, not in the way I expected. And over the years, that waiting transformed into something heavier. It became resentment, disguised as resignation. It became weariness disguised as maturity. I became someone who did things because I had to, not because I wanted to. Someone who smiled when necessary, but who inside was always counting the efforts, counting the disappointments, counting how much I gave and how much I didn't receive in return. Sitting in that silent kitchen with the cup of coffee cooling in my hands, I realized I had lived like this for decades, and that no one knew. Not my children, not my grandchildren, not the few friends who still called me occasionally. They saw a kind, polite woman who was always available. But I knew the truth. Inside, I was exhausted from being good without anyone seeming to care. And then, that morning, I had a thought that startled me because of its simplicity. What if I just stopped counting? Don't stop doing. Just stop expecting something in return. The idea hit me like a cold wind, and I didn't know what to do with it. I stood there, holding my cup, looking out the window, trying to understand where it had come from. It wasn't a joyful revelation. It was almost unsettling, because it meant I would have to admit something I had never not afore, that not boot off me's, of the version of myself I had built up over the years. I finished my coffee and washed the cup. I put on my navy blue coat, the same one I always wore when I went for a walk, and grabbed my bag. I had no plans. I just needed to leave the house. Get out of my own head, The walk to the city center took about 20 minutes. I knew every corner, every tree, every crack in the sidewalk. I passed the bakery where I bought bread on Sundays, the newsstand that was almost never busy, the little square where I sometimes sat to rest. Everything was the same, but inside, I felt that something had shifted. That's when I saw the girl. Ushir, the farmer's Ariadon. Her shoulders hunched as if she were carrying something too heavy. She must have been in her early 30s. Her hair was haphazardly tied back. She was wearing simple clothes, and a shopping bag lay beside her. And she was crying. Not the atelu crying. It was the restrained crying, the kind you do when you can't take it anymore, but you still have to hold it in because you're in public. I passed by her, and then I stopped. I don't know why I stopped. Normally, I would have moved on. After all, the world is full of sad people, and I couldn't carry everyone's sadness. But something about that girl pulled me back. Maybe it was the way she tried to hide her face, as if she were ashamed of breaking down there, in front of everyone. Maybe it was because I recognized myself in her. Not in her age, not in her situation, but in that way of being exhausted inside and still trying to appear normal on the outside. I took a few steps back and sat down next to her slowly, without saying anything. She looked up, surprised, and quickly wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to. I'm leaving now. You don't have to go," I said calmly. "Make yourself at home." She looked at me as if she didn't understand, as if she were waiting for me to say something more, to ask what had happened, to offer advice. But I didn't do any of that. I just sat there, next to her, looking at the street. We remained silent for a few minutes. An awkward silence, but not an uncomfortable one. And then she spoke, softly, almost as if she were talking to herself. "I don't know what to do anymore." I didn't answer. I just listened. "I try so hard," she continued, her voice trembling. "I do everything right. I work. I take care of the house. I take care of my sick mother. I wake up early. I go to bed late. And even so, it never seems enough. It seems like I'm never enough." My chest tightened because I knew that. I knew it so well it hurt. "And the worst part," she said, her voice now firmer but still broken, "is that nobody sees it. Nobody realizes how hard I try. My husband complains that the house is a mess. My mother complains that I don't spend enough time with her. My boss complains that I'm not as productive as I used to be. En premier. I just wanted someone to tell me that I'm doing the best I can." She stopped talking and hid her face in her hands. I stood there, feeling the weight of those words as if they were my own, because they were. Not exactly the same, but they came from the same place, from the same invisible weariness, from the same feeling of being seen, but not recognized. And then I did something I hadn't planned. I opened my purse, took out my wallet, and grabbed all the money I had inside. It wasn't much, maybe 150, 200 bills. Money I saved for small emergencies, for monthly shopping, for nothing in particular. I reached out and placed the folded bills on the seat between us. She looked at the money, confused. "What is that?" she asked. "You need to premier c'est simple." "I can't accept this," she replied, her voice almost desperate. I didn't ask for anything. "I don't want charity. It's not charity," I said, looking at her. "It's just help from someone who's been tired to." She kept looking at me, her eyes still wet, as if trying to understand who I was, why I was doing this. "And does it no like that?" "Not while she felt she was being paid out of pity. Then I stood up slowly and said, "You don't need to thank me. Just accept it. And when you can, when you feel a little lighter, do the same for someone else. Not because you should, but because you will want to." I left before she could answer. I didn't look back. I didn't wait to see if she would take the money or not. I just walked away, my heart beating strangely, racing, as if I had just done something big, even though it didn't seem like it. And as I walked back home, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt I had done something without expecting anything in return, without telling anyone, without holding a grudge, without weighing whether it was fair or not. I had simply given it away. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't leave me feeling empty. The days that followed were strange. Not because anything extraordinary had happened. On the contrary, everything continued exactly the same. I woke up, made coffee, sat in the same chair, looked out the same window. The routine was the same as always, but something inside me had changed. Something small, almost imperceptible, like a door you discover ajar after years of believing it was locked. I was thinking about that girl. I wondered if she had taken the money. I wondered if it had made any difference, even a small one. But, strangely, I didn't think about it anxiously. I wasn't waiting for confirmation, a response, proof that my gesture had been worthwhile. It was different. It was as if, for the first time, I had done something and let it go, without holding on, without clinging, without needing to know the outcome. And that scared me a little, because it meant I was beginning to realize how much, throughout my life, I had held on to everything too tightly. Every act of kindness, every effort, every kind word. I never truly let go of anything. I always stayed there, watching, waiting for the world to recognize what I had done. And when Rekam première elle dontoit, I am like a silent resentment that no one saw, but that I carried with me all the time. On Thursday of that week, my grandson, Daniel, came to visit me. He would show up every now and then, usually when he needed something borrowed money, a place to leave some boxes, help solving something he couldn't do on his own. I always helped, always, but deep down, I kept count. I counted how many times he only came when he needed something. I counted how many times he left without asking how I was. I counted how much I gave and how much he never reciprocated. This time it was different. He arrived mid-afternoon with his usual tired look, and before even saying hello, he started talking about a problem at work, about how difficult it was to pay the bills, about how he felt nothing was going right. I listened, as I always did. Première mad fils on let him talk. And when he finished, when he took that pause that usually came before ordering something, I felt that old feeling rising, the weight, the counting, the weariness of always being available for someone who was never available for me. But then I remembered that girl on the bench. I remembered how I had given without expecting anything in return. And I thought, what if I did that now? What if I simply helped my grandson without holding onto it as a debt to be collected later? So I did something I had never done before. I looked at him and said, "Daniel, do you want me to help you with anything?" He blinked, surprised. Normally, I waited for him to ask. This time, I offered, and the difference was enormous. Well, I didn't mean to bother you, Grandma," he said uncomfortably. "You're not bothering me," I replied calmly. "If I can help, I will." Not because I have to help, but because I want to. He looked at me as if he didn't know what to say. And then, slowly, he accepted. I gave him some money, not much, but enough to cover what he needed at that moment. And when he tried to thank me in an exaggerated way, like someone who felt guilty, I just smiled and said, "It's okay. You don't need to carry this like it's a debt." He left a few minutes later, still looking confused. And I stood there, alone in the kitchen, with a strange feeling in my chest. It wasn't relief. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something more subtle. It was as if I had let go of a rope I had been holding onto for so long that I didn't even remember why anymore. In the following days, I began to notice something. It wasn't obvious at all. It wasn't dramatic. But the people around me seemed different. Or maybe it was me who was different. And that's why I saw everything differently. My neighbor from the apartment next door, Mrs. Claudia, a woman in her 60s who had always been distant and grumpy, greeted me in the hallway. It wasn't just a polite wave. It was a genuine greeting with a small but authentic smile. I almost couldn't believe it. Mrs. Claudia never smiled. At least not at me. At the supermarket on Friday, the cashier, a young guy, about 20 years old, who usually barely looked at the customers while scanning their groceries, looked me in the eye and asked how I was. And he waited for an answer. It wasn't an automatic question, one of those people ask just out of politeness. He really wanted to know. "I'm fine," I said, surprised. "And you?" "Better now," he replied, smiling. "You have good energy. You know, whenever you come by, it feels like the day gets a little lighter." I was speechless because no one had ever said anything like that to me. No one had ever seen me that way. And the strangest part was that I wasn't doing anything different. I was just being me, but a version of myself that wasn't counting anymore. That wasn't expecting anything anymore. That was simply there, present, without holding grudges or silent demands. And people were feeling it. It was as if, by ceasing to expect something from them, I had created a space for them to approach. Not because they had to approach, but because they wanted to. On Saturday, I received a call from my daughter, Laura. She lived in another city, about 3 hours away, and rarely called. When she did call, it was quick, just to see if I was okay, if I needed anything. Those routine questions children ask elderly mothers. But this time it was different. "Mom," she said, her voice soft, "I was thinking about you." "Was it?" I asked, genuinely surprised. I was. And I don't know how to explain it properly, but I felt I needed to call. Not to ask if you need anything, just to talk, to know how you really are. We stayed on the phone for almost an hour. She told me about work, about problems with her husband, about how tired and lost she felt. And I listened. I didn't try to fix anything. I didn't give unsolicited advice. I just listened with an open heart, without judging, without weighing whether or not she should be telling me that. And at the end of the conversation, she said something that made me pause. "Mom, you seem different. I can't explain it, but you seem lighter, lighter." I had never thought of myself that way before. For so many years, I felt heavy. Heavy with tiredness, with hurt, with unmet expectations. But now, for the first time, someone was seeing me differently. And I realized it was because I was feeling differently. Because I had stopped carrying what wasn't mine to carry. Lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, I thought about everything that had happened since that Tuesday. I thought about the woman at the bank. I thought about Daniel. I thought about Mrs. Claudia, the cashier, Laura's call. And I thought about how, in a strange and unexpected way, my life seemed to be changing. But it wasn't the circumstances that were changing. It was me. I was changing the way I saw things, the way I related to people, the way I gave without expecting anything in return. And in some way that I still couldn't fully explain, the world seemed to be responding to it. Not magically, not immediately or spectacularly, but in a real way, consistently, as if, by changing my inner attitude, I had unlocked something that had been locked for years. And then I thought of something that made me tremble. If this was happening now, after a single gesture, what else could happen if I continued? If I truly let go of everything I was holding back? If I stopped counting once and for all? The answer came as a silent whisper in the back of my mind. You'll only find out if you try. And for the first time in decades, I wanted to try, even without knowing what would come next. Even without guarantees. Even without fully understanding what was happening. I wanted to try, but something still bothered me. A question I couldn't silence. A doubt that throbbed softly, deep down, every time I thought about that girl on the bench. Did she really take the money? Did it make any difference? Or was I deluding myself, creating a beautiful narrative around something that, in the end, hadn't changed at all? The answer came 2 weeks later. I was in the same pharmacy where I had first seen the young woman. I hadn't gone there for any particular reason. I just needed to buy some medicine for back pain that had been bothering me for the past few days. It was a Wednesday afternoon. The sky was partly cloudy, that kind of colorless day that makes you feel like nothing important is going to happen. I was in the checkout line when I felt someone touch my shoulder. I turned around and came face to face with her, the girl from the bank. For a moment, I couldn't speak. She was different. Not completely different. She still had the same face, but something about her had changed. She seemed less hunched over, as if the weight she carried that day had lessened, even if only a little. "Hi," she said, with a small, shy smile. "Do you remember me?" "I remember," I replied, still surprised. I was hoping to see you again," she said, her voice hesitant. "I didn't know where you lived. I didn't know your name. But I was hoping, because I needed to thank you." "You don't need to," I started to say, but she interrupted me gently. "I need to, because you have no idea what that meant to me." We left the pharmacy together and went to the same bench where we had first met. We sat there, side by side, and she began to speak. "That day," she said, looking at her hands, "I was at my breaking point. I had left home after a fight with my husband. He had yelled at me because I didn't have money to buy the things he wanted. My mother was in the hospital, and I couldn't pay all the bills. I felt like I was sinking, and I saw no way out." She paused, took a deep breath. "When you sat next to me and gave me that money, I didn't know what to think. I stood there, holding those bills, trying to understand why a stranger would do that for me. And you know what I realized?" She looked at me, her eyes shining. I realized that someone had seen me, for real, not as an obligation, not as a problem, but as a person who was tired and needed help. That changed something in me. I listened in silence, feeling my chest tighten. "I took the money," she continued. "I used it to pay some of my mother's hospital bills. And that night, when I got home, I sat down and had a real talk with my husband. I talked about how I was feeling, about how I couldn't do everything alone. And for the first time, he listened to me. He really listened, and he apologized. She smiled, a tired but genuine smile. Things didn't become perfect overnight. My mother is still sick. She still has bills to pay. But something changed. I changed. Because you reminded me that I wasn't alone. That there are still good people in the world. And that sometimes all we need is a small gesture to remind us that it's worth continuing. She took up a shoulder and Kaivalo, neat lifol dead. I don't have much, she said, handing me the envelope. But I've saved up a little over these past few weeks. I wanted to give it back to you, not because I feel I should, but because I want you to know that it made a difference. And I want you to be able to use it to help someone else if you need it. I looked at the envelope, but I didn't pick it up. You don't need to give it back, I said calmly. It was a gift, not a debt. I know, she replied, still holding the envelope. But I want to do this because you taught me that giving without expecting anything in return is liberating. And I want to feel that too. I want to pass it on. There was a gentle determination in her voice, and then I understood. It wasn't about the money. It was about her feeling capable of giving, of being generous, of not just being the person who receives, but also the person who gives. I took the envelope slowly and thanked them. Are you going to use this to help someone? She asked. I will, I promised. We stayed there for a few more minutes, talking about little things, about life, about how the days were difficult, but could also be good. And when got up to leave, Shugedme Etiket's hug says more than words can. Thank you, she whispered, for everything, and then she left. I sat on the bench, holding the envelope, feeling a lump in my throat. Because I had made that gesture without expecting anything, without needing confirmation. And yet, the confirmation had arrived, not because I asked for it, but because somehow what I had planted had grown and returned in a way I never imagined. I opened the envelope later, at home. Inside were 80 units. It wasn't much, but it was all she could give. And somehow, that was worth more than any larger amount. Because it wasn't about the money. It was about the intention. In the days that followed, I began to pay attention to something I had never noticed before. The small openings that appeared when I stopped counting, expecting, demanding. They broken before me. On a teatim a little more of the expectation, the wait. My granddaughter, Sophia, called me out of the blue on a Saturday afternoon. She was 15 years old and normally only spoke to me when my daughter forced her to. But this time was different. Grandma, can you help me with something? She asked, her voice uncertain. Of course, I said. Well, I'm writing a school paper about family stories, and I wanted to know what your life was like when you were my age. We talked for over an hour. I told her stories I didn't even remember I still had, about what it was like growing up in a different era, about the challenges I faced, about the dreams I had and the ones I left behind. And she really listened. She asked questions. She laughed. She got emotional. Finally, she said, Grandma, I never imagined you had gone through all of this. You are much stronger than I thought, and I realized that, for the first time, my granddaughter wasn't just seeing me as the old grandmother who baked cookies and gave birthday presents. She was seeing me as a person, as someone who had lived, suffered, loved, lost, as someone real. And that only happened because I stopped trying to control how people saw me. I stopped trying to prove my worth. I just was myself. And somehow, that created space for her to get closer. The following Monday, Mrs. Claudia, my neighbor, knocked on my door. She never knocked on my door. I opened it, surprised, and found her holding a dish covered with a cloth. I made a cake, she said bluntly, and I thought I'd bring you a piece. I was so surprised I could barely respond. Thank you, I said, taking the serving dish. You didn't have to. I know, she replied, with a half smile. But I wanted to. She turned to leave, but then stopped and looked back. You've been acting differently, you know, she said. More light. I can't explain it, but it's like you're more present. En tête. That's good for those around you. She didn't wait for me to answer. She just nodded and went back to her apartment. I stood there, by the door, holding the cake, trying to process what had just happened. Mrs. Claudia, the woman who never smiled, who never spoke to me beyond formal greetings, who always seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders, alone, without letting anyone get close. She had seen me, and more than that, she had responded. That night, sitting in the kitchen, eating the cake that Mrs. Claudia had made, I noticed something that made me stop chewing. The pattern was repeating itself. Every time I gave without expecting anything in return, without counting on it, without demanding anything, in return something came back. Not always from the same person, not always in the same way, but it always came back, like an echo, like a silent response from the universe saying, I saw what you did. And here is something in return. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was consistency. And then I thought, what else is to come? If this is happening now, with small gestures, with subtle changes, what else can happen if I continue? But at the same time, a part of me was still afraid. Fear of believing too much. Fear of being disappointed. Fear that, at some point, all of this would stop and I would go back to being the invisible woman I've always been. And that's when I realized this fear was also a way of counting, of fouetting, of demanding guarantees before surrendering myself completely. What if I let go of that fear too? What would happen if I simply trusted? Trust came slowly. It wasn't a conscious decision made in a single moment. It was more like a gradual surrender, like when you finally stop swimming against the current and let the water carry you. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't scare me. Weeks passed, and I continued. I kept letting go. I kept giving without expecting anything in return. I kept observing how the world around me seemed to respond in small, yet undeniable ways. The supermarket boy, the one who had told me I had good energy, started picking out the nicest fruits for me whenever I went shopping. He didn't need to do it. Nobody had asked him to, but he did, with a discreet smile, like someone sharing a secret. One day, while he was ringing up my groceries, I asked him his name. Lucas, he replied, a little surprised that I had asked. Lucas, I repeated as if I was saving it. Thank you for always choosing the best fruits for me. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me, really looked at me. Did you realize? Of course I noticed, and I appreciate it more than you can imagine. I saw his cheeks flush slightly, and then he said, softly, it's just that. You've always been kind to me. From the first day I came to work here, everyone treated me like I was invisible, just another employee. But you always looked me in the eye when you thanked me. You always asked how I was doing, and that made a difference. My chest tightened. You're not invisible, Lucas, and the work you do matters. He nodded, his eyes glistening slightly. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't the only one who had changed. The people around me were changing too. Because when you stop demanding recognition and simply offer genuine attention, you give permission for others to be seen as well. And being seen, truly seen, changes people. The owner of the newsstand, a woman in her 60s whom I had greeted for years without ever really talking to, began asking me about my day. And these weren't empty questions. She expected answers. She commented. She cared. Her name was Teresa. I found out. And she had a story. My husband died 5 years ago, she told me one morning, while I was leafing through a magazine I had no intention of buying. And since then, I wake up every day and come here. I open the newsstand, sell the newspaper, close the newsstand, go home. That's it. Every day the same. She paused, looking at the stacks of newspapers in front of her. But lately, I've been waiting for you to pass by. I don't know why. Maybe because you always stop. Always smile. Always seem to have time, even when you're in a hurry. En tête. That reminds me that there are still good people in the world. You're good too, Teresa, I said sincerely. She gave a sad smile. I don't know if I am. I've spent so much time just existing, just surviving, that I've forgotten what it's like to truly live. I recognize that, because I lived like late for decades. Premier c'est gentil. And then I did something I hadn't planned. I took her hand, which was resting on the counter, and squeezed it lightly. You matter, Teresa. Your presence here matters. And I'm happy every time I see you. I saw tears welling up in her eyes, and she squeezed my hand back, holding it for a longer moment, like someone holding onto a buoy in the middle of the sea. In the following days, I noticed that Teresa was different. She started arranging flowers on her stall. Simple, inexpensive flowers, but they brought color to that previously gray space. And when I passed by the following Monday, she handed me a white daisy. For you, she said, without further explanation. I took the flower home and placed it in a glass of water on the kitchen windowsill. And every time I looked at it, I remembered that small gestures create ripples. Ripples that touch other people, that make them want to give back, that remind them that they are still alive. My son, who lived in another city and rarely called, started sending me messages. Nothing profound. Just photos of his breakfast, a sunset he'd seen, a book he was reading. Little glimpses into his life that he had never shared before. And then, on a Thursday afternoon, he called me. Mom, I was thinking about you, he said, without preamble. Was he, she? I asked, surprised. I was, and I realized that I never really thank you for what you did for me, for everything you did. When I was a child, when I was a troubled teenager, when I left home and barely cared, you were always there. And I never said thank you. I remained silent, feeling a lump in my throat. You don't need to thank me, I said finally. I know, but I want to, because I realize that I'm raising huit patience, huit présence. And I want them to know, one day, where I learned that from. I learned it from you. We cried together on the phone. Not that sad kind of crying, but that crying of relief, of connexion, fainting cat for too long. And when I hung up, I realized he wasn't thanking me because I had demanded it. He was thanking me because he finally had the space to do so. Because I had stopped expecting recognition, and that created the freedom for him to offer it spontaneously. And all of this happened without me asking, without me demanding it, without me expecting it. It was as if, by ceasing to hold on so tightly, I had created space for things to come to me naturally. But what struck me most happened on a Sunday afternoon. I was returning from church not because I was particularly religious, but because I liked the silence of the place, the feeling of peace that came from being in a space where nothing was expected of me other than to be present. I was walking down the street when I saw a man sitting on the sidewalk near the square. He must have been about 50, maybe a little older. Worn clothes, unshaven, a distant look that I recognized immediately, the look of someone who had given up, not necessarily on life, but on hoping that life would get better. There was an empty bottle beside him, a torn bag with a few belongings, and that hunched posture of someone carrying an invisible weight that no one else can see. I walked past him. I took 3 for steps, and I stopped. Something inside me, that same thing that made me sit next to the girl on the bench, that same gentle force that I was learning to recognize and follow, pulled me back. I walked back slowly and sat down next to him on the sidewalk. Elle looked at him little suspicious, like someone who isn't used to being noticed, much less accompanied. "Hi," I said simply. "Hi," he replied, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't used it in a while. We stayed silent for a few minutes. I didn't ask anything. I didn't offer anything. I just sat there, next to him, watching the slow movement of the street. A car passing by, a child running after a dog, a leaf falling from a nearby tree, and then he spoke. "Aren't you afraid to sit here with me?" "Why would I?" I asked, turning to look at him. Because people usually do. They look at me like I'm dangerous, or disgusting, or invisible. Most of the time, invisible. Her voice was tired, not bitter, juste tiède. "I don't think you are any of those things." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his own hands, dirty, trembling slightly. It's been a long time since someone sat next to me without wanting something in return, without wanting to convert me or give me a sermon, or take a picture to post on social media showing how good a person they are. "I don't want anything," I said honestly. "I just thought you might want company." He glanced at me sideways, as if trying to decide if he could trust me, and then, slowly, he began to speak. He recounted that he had lost his job 3 years earlier, that his wife had left, taking the children, that he tried to hold everything together, but couldn't. He started drinking. He lost his apartment. He lost his friends. He lost his dignity, he said, as if dignity were something you lose all at once, and not something that is taken from you little by little, in small daily cuts. "I tried to start over a few times," he continued, staring into space. "I picked up odd jobs. I slept in shelters. I tried to stop drinking, but I always stumbled again. And at some point, I just stopped trying, because when you try so many times and always fail, there comes a point when it seems easier to accept that you're just worthless." My chest ached listening to that, because I knew the feeling of being worthless. Maybe not in the same way. Maybe not with the same intensity. But I knew the taste of thinking you don't matter, of believing that your efforts will never be enough. "It's funny," he said, with a bitter smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We spend our whole lives trying to prove we have value, trying to be seen. And when nobody sees you anymore, you start to believe you really have no value at all." I remained silent for a moment, choosing my words carefully. "You have value." Premier s'affirme ligli at him. Even if no one is telling you that right now, even if you can't see it, you do. He looked at me, and I saw his eyes welling up, tears that he tried to hold back, blinking rapidly, looking up, as if he didn't want to break down right there, in front of a stranger. "How can you be so sure?" he asked, his voice breaking. Because I spent my whole life thinking my worth depended on what others thought of me. And when no one seemed to care, I believed I didn't matter. But I was wrong. And you are too. I took a deep breath. Your worth doesn't depend on your job. It doesn't depend on where you sleep. It doesn't depend on how many times you've fallen. You have value because you are here, because you are human, because italwea. It always will. He lowered his head and began to cry. Not a restrained cry, but a deep cry, the kind that comes from a place that has been locked away for a long time. And I just sat there, letting him cry without trying to fix things, without trying to rush things, without trying to make him feel better just so I could feel comfortable. Sometimes, the best thing you can do for someone is simply to stay. After it's ekalmed done. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his worn shirt and looked at me. Why did you do that? I asked. Why did you sit here? Why did you care? Because someone did this for me once, I said, thinking of the young woman at the bank, of how it had all begun. And it reminded me that there is still kindness in the world. And I wanted to remind you of that too. I stayed with him for a few more minutes. We talked about little things, about how beautiful autumn was this year, about how quickly time passed, about how, even when everything seems lost, it's still worth trying one more time. And before leaving, I took the envelope the bank teller had given me out of my bag, the 80 units she had collected to return to me. I had kept that money without knowing exactly why, but now I knew. I held the envelope for a moment, feeling its weight, not the weight of the money, but the weight of the intention, the generosity, the courage to give even when you have little. And then I extended it to him. What is this? He asked, confused, looking at the envelope without picking it up. A start, I said, not to solve everything, but to remember that someone saw you today, and that you matter. He stared at the envelope in my hands, motionless. I saw conflict in his eyes, pride, shame, gratitude, all mixed together. I can't accept this, he said finally. You can, I replied, still holding the envelope. And if you want, when you're feeling a little better, when you're on your feet again, you can pass this on. It can help someone else. Not because you should, but because you'll want to. He looked at me for a long moment, and then, slowly, he reached out and took the envelope. I don't know what to say, he whispered. You don't need to say anything. Just try again, one more time. And if you fall, get up and try again, because you deserve a better life than this. And I believe you can achieve it. I stood up slowly, my legs aching a little from age and from having sat on the hard sidewalk. He stood up too, holding the envelope carefully as if it were something precious. What's your name? He asked. Marlene. And yours? Thomas. Thomas, I repeated, keeping it to myself. You're going to be okay. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was hope. And sometimes hope is all someone needs to take another step. I walked back home with a heavy heart, but also strangely light. Heavy because I had witnessed someone's pain up close. Light because I had done something small, perhaps, but something real. And as I was walking, I felt something strange. I felt that the money had come full circle. It had started with me, passed through the bank, Helena, returned to me, and now it was with Thomas. And perhaps, one day, it would pass to someone else. And that person to another, and another, and I realized that was it. It wasn't about the money. It never was. It was about creating a movement, a wave, something that started small, but spread, that touched one person, and then another, and then another. Like stones thrown in that multiply. And all I had done was begin. Let go, give without expecting anything in return, and let life do the rest. In the following days, something curious happened. I started getting calls. Not many, but unexpected calls. From my daughter, Lavra, who invited me to spend a weekend at her house. Just because I missed you, she said, without any other reason. From Daniel, my grandson, who showed up one Saturday morning with a bouquet of flowers. I stopped by the florist and thought of you, he explained, almost shyly. He had never done that before. From Sophia, my granddaughter, who wanted to show me the work she had done about me for school. She had gotten the highest grade, and at the end of the presentation, she had written, "My grandmother taught me that strength isn't about doing everything alone. It's about knowing when to ask for help and when to offer it, and they always said the same thing. You look different, Grandma. You seem lighter. You seem happy." And the strange part was that I wasn't trying to appear any of that. I was just being, just existing without demanding, without counting, without expecting. And somehow that was radiating. It was touching the people around me in a way I never imagined possible. Donna Claudia, who now had coffee with me every Thursday, told me that she had called her daughter after years of not speaking. "It was because of you," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "You made me realize I was wasting time, holding grudges over little things. And life is too short for that." They hadn't fully reconciled yet, but they were talking, and that was a start. Lucas, from the supermarket, told me that he had started studying at night. "I want to go to college," he revealed, his eyes shining. "I want to be a teacher. Because you made me realize that small gestures matter. That treating people with kindness isn't weakness, it's strength. And I want to teach that to other people." Even Teresa, from the newsstand, seemed more alive. "I started taking painting classes," she told me, almost embarrassed. "I always wanted to, but I thought it was too late, that I was too old to start something new. But you reminded me that it's never too late. So I went, and I'm loving it." And the girl from the bank, Helena, appeared again. This time, she brought her mother along. Her mother was better. Still frail, using a cane, but better. Her face was full of color. Her eyes were alive. She was discharged last week, Helena told me, smiling. And the first thing she wanted to do was come and meet you. I told her about you, about what you did. Helena's mother took my hand and squeezed it. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling, "for taking care of my daughter when I couldn't, for showing her that kindness still exists." I didn't know what to say. I just hugged them both, feeling my heart overflow. And Helena whispered in my ear, "I started going to therapy. I'm learning to forgive myself. I'm learning that asking for help isn't a failure. And I started doing what you did. When I see someone in need, I help without expecting anything in return. Just because I want to. Because you taught me that it's possible." One night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark, I thought about everything that had happened since that Tuesday when I sat next to Helena on the bench. I thought about how it all began with a single gesture. I thought about how that gesture had multiplied, touching not just one life, but many. Helena, Thomas, Dona Cláudia, Lucas, Teresa, Daniel, Laura, Sophia. And how many other people I didn't even know. How many lives touched by people I had touched. It was like an invisible web spreading, growing, multiplying, and then I thought of something that gave me goosebumps. What if it didn't stop? What if, by continuing to let go, by continuing to give, by continuing to be this lighter version of myself, the movement continued to grow, touching more people, creating more echoes? I didn't know the answer. But for the first time, I didn't need to know. Because I had learned that life isn't about controlling outcomes. It's not about guaranteeing that everything will work out. It's not about expecting recognition or reward. It's about planting and trusting and letting go and let life do the rest. I fell asleep that night with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in decades. And deep in my heart, a silent certainty. Something bigger was happening. Something that started small, with an elderly woman sitting next to a stranger on a bench. But now it was spreading in ways I could never have planned or controlled. And I had only been the beginning. But there was still something I didn't know. Something that was unfolding silently, far from my eyes, in places I would never have imagined. Thomas, the man on the sidewalk, Helena, the girl at the bank, Donna, Claudia Lucas, Teresa, they were all now carrying a seed. And seeds have a habit of growing in unexpected places, to put down deep roots, to bloom when you least expect it. I just didn't know yet how far it would spread, nor how long it would last. Nor do we know how many lives would be touched by something that began simply because an old woman decided to stop counting on Jujiv. Autumn was ending when I realized my body was changing, not dramatically, not overnight. But there were small, subtle signs that I recognized. The tiredness that took longer to go away, the shortness of breath when climbing stairs, the joint pain that didn't improve even with medication. I knew what it was. I was 78 years old. My body was gently telling me that time was running out. I went to the doctor on a rainy Monday in November. He ordered tests. He asked questions. He looked at me with that professional expression doctors learn to use when they want to hide concern. And when the results came back, a week later, he called me in for a chat. "Marlene," he said, using my name in a way that foreshadowed what was to come. "We need to talk about a few things," he explained. He used technical terms that I kind of understood, kind of didn't. He talked about the heart, about how tired it was, about how the arteries weren't functioning as they should, about possible treatments, but which, at my age, with my history, might not make that much of a difference. "How long?" I asked simply. He hesitated. "It's hard to say for sure. It could be a few months. It could be a year. It could be longer if we're lucky. But, Marlene, I need you to understand that your heart is weak, and any further exertion, any stress, could accelerate things." I listened. I thanked them. I left the doctor's office with a prescription for new medication and a strange feeling in my chest, not fear, not exactly, but a feeling of recognition, as if my body was finally confirming something my soul had known for some time. My time was running out. I walked home slowly, clutching the prescription in my bag, gazing at the streets I knew so well. And I thought, what am I going to do with the time I have left? The answer came quickly, clearly, without hesitation. I will continue. Keep letting go. Keep giving. Keep being this lighter version of myself. Not because I wanted to leave a legacy. Not because I wanted to be remembered. But because, for the first time in my life, I was truly living, and I didn't want to stop. In the weeks that followed, I continued my routine. I would wake up, make coffee, walk the streets. I would talk to people. I would smile. I would listen. I would give when I could. I would let go when I needed to. And always, always, the world would respond. Donna, Claudia started having coffee with me once a week. She never talked much about why she had started doing this. She would just show up with cake or cookies and sit in my kitchen. We would talk about small things, about the past, about her viutal sogo. And little by little, I realized that she was letting go of something too. Something she had held onto for so long that she no longer remembered its weight. The young man from the supermarket, whose name I later learned was Lucas, told me that he had started studying at night. He wanted to go to college. He wanted to be a teacher. And he said it was because I had made him realize that small gestures mattered. That treating people with kindness wasn't weakness. It was strength. The young woman from the bank I found out her name was Helena appeared again. This time, she brought her mother along. Her mother was better, still frail, but better. And Helena told me, with tears in her eyes, that she had started therapy, that she was learning to forgive herself, that she was learning that asking for help wasn't a failing, and the man on the sidewalk. I hadn't seen him again since that Sunday. But one afternoon in December, while I was walking through the square, someone called me. I turned around and almost didn't recognize him. It was him, but he was different, shaved, wearing clean clothes, and, most importantly, with a different look in his eyes, a look that was no longer empty. Marlene, he said, and I was surprised to learn that he remembered my name. I didn't remember saying it. Hi, I replied, smiling. I wanted to see you. I wanted to tell you that what you did for me, that day changed everything. Has it changed? I asked, genuinely curious. Things changed because, for the first time in years, someone saw me, and that reminded me that I was still here, that I could still try. So I tried. Premier sous tel paitenbrem. I got a temporary job. It's not a big deal, but it's a start. He smiled, and I could see it was a genuine smile. And you know what else? Last week, I saw a boy sitting alone on the sidewalk with that same look I had, and I sat down next to him. I gave him some of the money I had. Not much, but enough for him to eat that day. And I said the same thing you said to me. When you can do the same for someone else, my chest tightened. And I realized I was seeing something I never imagined I would see. The circle was expanding. It wasn't just me anymore. It wasn't just the girl at the bank anymore. It was a current, a movement, people touching people, small gestures multiplying, echoes spreading, and all because, in a single day, I had decided to stop counting, stop waiting, stop holding on. En jugivdite sitting wrote a letter. I didn't know who I was writing for. Maybe for my children, maybe for my grandchildren, maybe for no one. But I needed to put what I was feeling on paper. I needed to record, somehow, what I had learned. I wrote about how I spent my whole life waiting for the world to recognize my worth, about how I carried grudges and expectations as if they were badges of honor, about how, when I finally let go of all that, life began to flow in a way I never imagined possible. I wrote about the girl on the bench, about the man on the sidewalk, about Dona Claudia Lucas, Helena, Daniel, Lara Sofdingo gesture, and about how that gesture multiplied, creating an invisible web of kindness that I could never have planned or controlled. And then I wrote the most important part. If you're reading this, know that life isn't about being recognized. It's not about being seen or valued by others. It's about letting go, about giving without expecting anything in return, about trusting that when you plant kindness, it grows even if you never see the harvest. And it's about understanding that what you do matters. It always matters, even when it seems small, even when no one is watching, because every gesture creates an echo. And those echoes can last much longer than you imagine. I folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and stored it in my desk drawer. I didn't know if anyone would read it, but it didn't matter. I had written it because I needed to, and that was enough. The days went by. December arrived, and with it the cold of winter. My body was weaker. I could feel it. But my mind was clear, and my heart even tired, even fragile was at peace. On Christmas Eve, my children came to visit me. Lavra brought her grandchildren. We stayed together, talking, laughing, remembering old stories. And, in a moment of silence, Lavra looked at me and said, "Mom, you're radiating. I can't explain it, but you seem complete." I smiled, because that's exactly how I felt, complete, not because everything was perfect, not because I had all the answers, but because I had let go of what needed to be let go of. And in doing so, I had found something I had been searching for my whole life without knowing it: peace. That night, lying in bed, looking out the window at the dark, starry sky, I thought about everything that had happened since that autumn Tuesday. I thought about how a single gesture had changed everything, not just for me, but for so many other people. And I thought about how, even though my time was running out, that gesture would continue. It would continue to echo. It would continue to touch lives I would never know, creating waves I would never see. And that was enough. More than enough. I closed my eyes, feeling the weariness in my body, but also the lightness in my heart. And, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what was to come, because I knew I had lived in truth, and that, somehow, this would continue. Even after I'm no longer here, winter has passed. And with it, Marlene. She died on a quiet January morning, sleeping peacefully, without pain. Her body simply stopped, gently, as if it knew it had already done everything it needed to do. The funeral was small, just family and a few close friends. But there were faces there that no one expected. Helena was there, holding her mother's hand, who had also gone. She didn't know Marlene's family. But she needed to be there. She needed to say goodbye to the woman who, with a single gesture, had changed the course of her life. Lucas was there. The supermarket boy. He didn't know how to explain to Marlene's family who he was or why. He was there. So he just stood in the back, silent, holding a simple bouquet of flowers. Donna Claudia was there, crying silently, holding a piece of paper in her hand, a cake recipe that Marlene had asked for the last time they had coffee together. And the man from the sidewalk was there too. Nobody knew who he was, but he stayed until the end, watching, remembering a Sunday afternoon when an elderly woman sat beside him and reminded him that he still had value. After the funeral, Lavra found the letter. It was in the desk drawer, in the white envelope, with the words for anyone who needs to read this handwritten on the front. Lavra read it. She cried, and then she showed it to her siblings, and they showed it to their children. And, little by little, that letter began to circulate, not only among the family, but among the people Marlene had touched. Helena read it and shared it with other mothers she knew, other tired women who needed to hear that they were not alone. Lucas read it and decided he wanted to be the kind of teacher who truly saw people. Mrs. Claudia read it and, for the first time in years, called her daughter, with whom she hadn't spoken in a decade. And the man on the sidewalk read it and decided he wanted to continue what Marlene had started. So he began to look for invisible people. People sitting alone on benches, on sidewalks, in forgotten corners of the world. And he would sit beside them. He would listen. And when he could, he would give them something. Not because he had much, but because he wanted to pass it on. And the current continued. Months later, years later, in places Marlene had never been, people were doing things she would never have seen. A teenager helping a classmate who was being bullied. A nurse staying a few extra minutes with a patient who had no visitors. A bus driver waiting for an elderly lady to finish climbing the steps, even though it delays the journey. Small gestures, invisible, unrecorded, uncelebrated, but real, and everyone, in some way, connected to that autumn Tuesday when a 78-year-old woman decided to sit next to a stranger and give without expecting anything in return. Marlene never knew the full extent of what she had done. I never knew how many lives his final act of kindness touched. I never knew that the circle she started would continue to expand, touching people she would never meet, in places she would never visit, in times she would never see. But she didn't need to know, because she had planted it, and released, and confident, and life did the rest. If this story touched you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. That way, you'll be notified whenever a new story like this is shared here. And if you feel like it, leave a comment. You can share if you've ever experienced something similar, what this story evoked in you, or even where you're watching it from. Sometimes, writing a few words is the first step in realizing that you're not alone. And remember, every gesture matters. Every act of kindness creates an echo. And those echoes can last much longer than you imagine, even when you're no longer here to see it.